Welcome everyone to the first panel of this event, Architecture and Ecologies of Amazonia, entitled Forest Environments. To introduce this panel, I would like to recall an extract from David Kopenawa's The Spirit of the Forest of his book, The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman of 2023. When they speak about the forest, says Kopenawa, these white people often use another word. They call it environment. This word is not ours, and until recently, we did not know it either. For us, what these white people refer to this way is simply what remains of the forest and land that have been hurt by their machines. It is what's left of everything they've destroyed so far. I don't like this word. The earth cannot be divided as if the forest is just as a leftover part. We are inhabitants of this forest, and if it is not torn apart this way, we know that we will die with it. I will prefer the white people to talk about nature or ecology as a whole as one thing. If we defend the entire forest, it will stay alive. End of quote. From this perspective, ecology, the household of nature, shares the same origins as the capitalist word economy. While we use ecology to describe interconnected systems of water, soil, atmosphere, and their intricate relationships with all living beings, it is essential to acknowledge how it has been co-opted and reshaped by systems of exploitation, reducing the complexity of the forest to something that can be measured, compartmentalized, and commodified. But this same forest matter that makes up an ecology encrypts a whole different story outside this Western rationale and can give us urgent lessons if we are eager to see, hear, and feel what the forest has to teach us. I'm going to introduce very briefly to other speakers for this panel in their order of appearance. First, we have William Valle, which is a professor at the Department of Anthropology at Tulane University. He has conducted ethnographic fieldwork dealing with forest peoples in the Brazilian Amazon, Ecuadorian Amazon, and peninsular Malaysia. Paulo Tavares, which is going to join us via Zoom, is an architect, author, educator at the University of Brasília. He also leads the spatial advocacy agency Autonoma. His practice dwells at the frontiers between architecture, visual cultures, and advocacy. His curatorial project, Terra, in collaboration with Gabriela de Matos, was awarded the Golden Lion for Best National Participation at La Biennale di Venecia in 2023. Clark Erickson is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Since 1974, Erickson's Andean and Amazonian research focuses on the contribution of archaeology to understanding the complex human history of the environment and cultural activities that have shaped the earth. Following, we will have Christina Lyons, who is an associate professor at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Since 2004, she has conducted participatory action and ethnographic research with rural and urban communities in the Colombian Amazon. She is the legal representative of the NGO Colectivo Ríos y Reconciliación and guardian of a civil society nature reserve, La Hojarasca, in the Andean Amazonian foothills of Colombia. Then we will have Túlio Andrade, who's joining us via Zoom also, who is the head for climate negotiation at Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and at 2024-2025 Perry Waldhaus visiting fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. He served as a climate negotiator from 2010 to 2018 and had positions in London and Tokyo. His academic pursuits include research on cybernetics and new ecology at Tokyo University of the Arts, where he explored the role of contemporary art in foresting climate action and resilience. With this brief introduction and a small presentation of each speaker, we first are welcoming to the podium to William Valle and Paulo Tavares for the first lecture. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Very nice. Very good to be here. Glad to meet new people. Good to see old friends of mine I haven't seen for a long time, too. This is a co-authored paper with my architect colleague, Paulo Tavares, who can't be here. He's in Sao Paulo right now working on a project with Guarani people. The next one. The Euro-Western society is based on a nature-culture divide. If we want to start with Rome, we could say it starts with the idea of the res publica, which is sort of the public space that is the city versus the forest, which is no longer public or cultural space. It's something else. It's outside the city. But then we have to ask ourselves, in the new context of what's being found in Amazonia beneath the forest cover, thanks to archaeological technology and new ways of thinking from the point of view of historical ecology, what is a city? There are kinds of cities that don't exist anymore on the planet that can only be seen archaeologically. And in some cases, they're cities that we would consider urban mixed with forests. Some archaeologists would call it low-density urbanism. Others are calling it garden urbanism. But the question is, what is a forest? Can they ever be the same thing? And in a lot of this recent research from the point of view of historical ecology, which is a research program, we're finding that indeed they're not separable. And David Kopenawa's words are very appropriate to our point here. In the indigenous concept, I mean, there is no environment vis-a-vis humans. It's everything is sort of all together. We don't divide up the world in a reductionistic fashion the way we do in our own scientific Western thinking. Not that that's wrong, but it's different. It's what Philippe Descola of France calls a naturalism that he opposes to animism and other ways of thinking about the forest. Anyway, my colleague Carol Crumley and I wrote a paper bringing together the recent literature in this research program of historical ecology, which essentially proposes the same idea. Instead of seeing people as adapted to the forest or as simply harmoniously, not impacting it and being like any other organism out there in the forest, as we get from the point of view, let's say, von Humboldt, Alexander von Humboldt, one of the first explorers of the Amazon, sees the native people fitting into the background of the environment. Historical ecology takes a point of view that where often there has been the concept of people adapting to hostile or difficult environments from a Euro-Western point of view, in fact, are managing those environments. They're having an impact on them. They're changing even the species composition, and sometimes the species composition can go up in numbers. We're more used to it going down. We're going to talk a little bit about two kinds, from the point of view of historical ecology, two kinds of ways of impacting the environment that people have, and the Amazon included. One is primary landscape transformation, where there is a huge turnover of species because of an impact of humans. That can go down, and that's primary landscape type 1. But it sometimes, counterintuitively to a scientific Western way of thinking, can go up. Not that people are changing DNA, but they are impacting the forest by creating certain spaces where species can exist that wouldn't otherwise exist there, thanks to light gaps and thanks to forest management that they themselves are in charge of. So I want to show you this, the city of Altamira. It's on the Xingu River, which is one of the big affluents of the Amazon. It's about the size of the Ohio River. And it's got a huge hydroelectric dam project that was put in there called Belo Monte a few years ago. It's the 5th biggest hydroelectric project in the world. It's got about 19 turbines that are all online now, and it destroyed a huge amount of the vegetation and the fish species and others around it when it was put in. And it caused tremendous disruption of the local landscape, such that I would call a primary landscape transformation type 1, where things go down numbers. It also changed a lot of people's livelihoods. So this is where the dam is at Altamira. Here's the Rio Xingu goes in there. This is the Trans-Amazon Highway, by the way, and you see the fish spine pattern of deforestation along it. That was built in the 70s. I want to talk about the Iriri River, which drains into the Xingu in this area, which is about the size of Maryland. This is what the dam looks like. It's an Amazon version of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, which we were warned about a long time ago. I think landscape transformation from a historical ecological point of view can be put into 4 categories, where you have this type 1, where there's a complete overturn of species, and type 2, also overturn of species, but where the species go up, not down. And secondary, where there are less impactful impacts, but that also involve either a decrease or an increase in species diversity, just as a way of getting a handle on the 4 different kinds of human impacts. Here we have a reserve that was put in the early 2000s of this area between the Xingu and the EDD. And a number of the people that were still already here, there were forest extractors of non-timber forest products like Brazil nuts, kumaru beans, which are used in perfumes, cacao beans, rubber, tapping of rubber, Have Brazilians, all things that don't involve cutting trees down. This is how these people made their living. They were forest peasants in Brazil that lived along the edges of the Iriri and the Xingu. And 25 years ago, the government made a reserve there, allowed these extractive reserves to exist where people lived. The rest of it is off limits for humans. The only thing is there was already 100 people along this stretch of land, which is about 100 miles long, and they were told to leave. Several did not. And so we conceived of a project to go there and see, well, are they having a bad impact on the environment? And what we found in doing inventories in here is the forest is very rich. People are still using it. There are a lot of Brazil nut trees. They're extracting goods. They're not cutting the forest down, but it's an anthropogenic forest. People made that forest. Indigenous people made it a long, long time ago. And the indigenous people are gone, but the forest peasants who are there are in a way maintaining this ancient primary transformation, which I would call type 2, by secondary transformations, which are minimal impacts. This is the Iriri River Basin. This is where we did inventories. And these are people that would have lived there before. This is an Arawete man from the Xingu Basin I knew a long time ago. And I went with archaeologists these were our transects of forest inventory. Each is 1 kilometer long. And we found that an indigenous village existed here about 300 years ago. And the archaeologists found the dark earth that's evidence of human occupation and use. And there were no Brazil nut trees in here, but out here there were Brazil nut trees and others. It kind of makes sense. You wouldn't have the Brazil nut trees here, we have a person here who showed that Brazil nut trees are domesticated, Professor Shepard. One of the interesting things is they don't have them right there in the village, which makes sense. You don't want a Brazil nut tree falling on your head, right? Or the seeds, because they're gigantic. They're like bowling balls when they come down. So that made sense to us that this was intentional. And these elderly people who live there, peasant people, are extractors. As I said, this is a cacao tree in the forest, non-domesticated but still useful as cacao, and makes a seed you could make chocolate from. This elderly lady told us a lot about the past history because the people who were not indigenous moved there during the rubber boom of the 1890s. And here we are measuring a Brazil nut tree. Here are 2 colleagues that work with me in the forest. And what we found is that we found a Brazil nut tree is it completely fallen over, and we took out of the middle of it xylem, got that dated C14 dating to about 1780. And the tree had fallen of its own accord. What that means is that the people who've been there, that only got there in the 1890s, have not reduced the forest diversity because the forest was still there 300 years ago. I mean, it's the same forest. So we were able to get that to the Attorney General's office, who works with that area in Brazil. The Advogado Federal, I forget exactly. Anyway, she's based in Altamira, and she was able to get this, allow those people to stay there indefinitely by law. So that's an example of what I would call applied historical ecology. We found that both areas were very high in species diversity, again, very comparable to what we see in Amazonia generally. So again, not impacted in a negative way by the natives. In fact, even the area that gets a little bit flooded was high in species diversity, and that was a surprise. Now, here's another kind of primary landscape transformation where species go up, and that is the area of the geoglyphs, which we're going to get to in a minute. I've been working on this project with my colleague Paulo Tavares. We did this paper together, and this was an earlier collaboration that we did. Now I want to talk about secondary landscape transformations. 2 minutos. Okay. Very briefly. They can have increases in beta diversity. That means the diversity between one area and another. So here you see from the air the Kapor Indians who practice Swidden agriculture, sometimes called slash and burn. This is a new clearing that they have. Over here is an older one, so you see the vegetation's lower, and over here even lower. And I asked, well, why did you leave this rig of forest around there? And they said, well, because the fire, when we burned this, would have escaped into there and burned up plants we're still harvesting over several years. But another reason is they put in little fire breaks around the edge in case of a bad year like an El Nino when the tree forest is unusually dry. And so what happens is species of trees come in here via wind and birds that otherwise only exist where you have a lot of sunlight, light gaps, which you don't have in the high forest. And they will be able to grow there. And then what happens is you get it, this kind of will become a forest, but it's different from the forest around here, there too, adding to the species, in fact. Secondary landscape transformation, type 2. Given that I only have 2 minutes, I wanted to give you a quick analogy. In Japan, you have looking gardens, you have bonsai. Primary landscape transformation type 2 is like this looking garden, only it's maintained through time. The idea is that you don't walk around it and you're supposed to look at it. It's beautiful. You see it from a tea house. Bonsai is also a management of nature in the sense of, the merging of art and nature. Another analogy is with these quillas or these calabash bowls. The Kapor make one like this. They paint it. It's going to be temporary. The same material is used by the Tarascans of prehistoric Mexico, but they lacquerize it. Ruth Benedict, an archaeologist or anthropologist, long ago said, once something has become lacquered, it's no longer that something anymore, it's lacquer. It completely saturates the original material, which is real soft. This is primary, like primary landscape transformation, this is like secondary. It's an analogy. This is primary, a triple ditch geoglyph. We don't have time to talk about the geoglyphs, where I've also done research, and that will be left for some other time. Thank you.
So we're going to have questions after the four speakers have finished. So now we have Clark Erickson to invite him to join us, please.
In anthropology and archaeology, traditional Western cultural evolutionary terminology and classification of past societies are along a continuum of complexity based on Victorian age, savagery, barbarism, civilization, and the more contemporary bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states. The critical role of cities and urbanism in cultural evolution has been modeled traditionally on classic Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Mediterranean urban origins. And unfortunately, these are still used in many archaeology textbooks to classify societies. Recently, especially in The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, present new alternatives from the archaeological, historical, and ethnographic record that undermines entrenched cultural evolutionary assumptions about hierarchy, political centralization, inequality, and linear progress from the primitive to the complex. And this is sort of considered to be necessary for cities, urbanism, and societal complexity. While questioning the origin, development, and character of early cities, the concept of civilization itself, these critiques present valuable alternatives in the archaeological record that, of how past societies actually organize themselves. Here I add recent contributions from the archaeology of landscapes and historical ecology to understanding the everyday life of a peopled past, to provide critique and alternatives. Colleagues and I argue for a broader cross-cultural view of urbanism in prehistory, in that the same number of interconnected people organized in a traditional city can be arranged on a multi-scalar landscape in a variety of possible organizations and structures, most of which are documented now in the archaeological record. Most of the empty space between clearly defined residential sites on settlement maps we now recognize as cultural landscape. Landscape archaeology and historical ecology now provide a powerful perspective to document and understand the everyday lives of past peoples who spent most of their lifetime outside in these non-site spaces, working, moving, interacting, communicating, and creating the mundane built environment. Historical ecology contributes to this perspective in that most of the terrestrial Earth is anthropogenic, at least to some degree, if not a large degree. Humans have transformed, created, enhanced, and managed their environments what they want through their daily activities over centuries and millennia. Closer to the themes of this symposium, the archaeology of landscapes and historical ecology now treat the city and urbanism as a cultural landscape. The pre-Columbian cultures of the Bolivian Amazon and southwestern Amazonia provide an interesting contrast and challenge to traditional explanations of complex society and long-term stereotypes about the prehistory of the region, especially in terms of the past character, impact, and achievements of Amazonian peoples and alternative forms of urbanism. The Bolivian Amazon, or the Llanos de Mojos, is a landscape of savannas, wetlands, gallery forests, and forest islands. Because of the lack of relief and heavy rainfall, most of the landscape is a floodplain, and seasonal changes can be profound. In addition to being one of the largest seasonally inundated environments in the world, the Bolivian Amazon is an excellent example of an anthropogenic or domesticated landscape. The region is covered with pre-Columbian earthworks such as raised fields, causeways, canals, reservoirs, fish weirs, fish ponds, ring ditches, artificial forest islands, and large occupation mounds, all part of an integrated urban-like landscape over thousands of years. In the Bolivian Amazon, landscape enhancements can be classified as agriculture in the form of raised fields, communication and transport networks that form in the form of causeways, canals, and river shortcuts, fisheries in the form of fish weirs, ponds, canals, and reservoirs, and miscellaneous water management structures. Raised fields are the most impressive example of landscape engineering at a regional scale in Amazonia. Raised field platforms of earth were raised in seasonally inundated savannas and wetlands to cultivate crops. Based on excavations and experiments, the raised fields serve multiple functions, including drainage, crop improvement through soil aeration, mixing of horizons and doubling of topsoil, water management through simultaneously providing drainage and irrigation, and nutrient creation, capture, and recycling in the canals beside the platforms. Experiments show impressive crop production of nearly double that of non-raised fields, it's certainly in their first years. In addition to traditional crop cultivation on the platforms, the canals provided aquatic resources such as edible fish, snails, reptiles, and amphibians. And the canals also trap organic sediments that can periodically be used to renew the soil fertility of the platforms. Experimental raised fields have shown that aquatic vegetation and aquatic animals thrive in these artificial environments. The decomposition of plant matter also provides rich nutrients. The space between the canals of the raised fields is about equal to the size of the platforms. A single square kilometer of raised fields could hold up to 250,000 cubic meters of water during inundation of a half meter and retain much of that after the floods recede in the dry season. Raised fields also expand the biologically rich wetland terrestrial ecotone, and a single hectare of raised fields creates some 4 linear kilometers of this very rich combination of this interface between terrestrial and aquatic. Oops. Raised fields also cover hundreds of square kilometers. In the creation of these environments, the farmers were able to cultivate lands that under normal conditions would have very little potential. Pre-Columbian inhabitants of the Bolivian Amazon also transformed the environment into a highly patterned landscape of networks of raised earthen causeways and canals. These features provided multiple functions, including transportation, communication, territorial markers, and monumental statements. In addition, their construction was a form of water management and aquatic production. Causeways were always associated with adjacent canals from which the earth was removed in their construction. They ranged from 1 to 10 meters wide, and most of them are about 1 kilometer long, although the longest we have is 7.5 kilometers, nearly perfectly straight, most of them. They often connect to other causeways, creating complex networks of communication totaling 900 square kilometers in the Boweries region alone. As you can see in this reconstruction, the dry surfaces were for pedestrians, and the aquatic part, the canal, was used for large canoes. In addition to the formal causeways and canals, there are thousands of linear depressions crisscrossing the savannas between forest islands, which we interpret as canoe paths. Traditional canoes can easily be poled across, you need just a few centimeters of water, skim them across these surfaces to connect dispersed settlements across the landscape. You can get a sense of some of the density of these canoe paths between 2 forest islands shown in black here. We mapped several hundred features within a few kilometers. Here, almost every family may have had their own private little canoe path to get between settlements, visit kin on nearby, neighbors on nearby settlements. On a nearly flat landscape with little grade, the construction of walls of essentially walls or levees of causeways between the high grounds along the rivers, adjacent rivers, can create an interesting concept of capture and management of water. For instance, a 1 meter tall causeway connecting one river levee to another on this nearly flat landscape could capture 5 million cubic meters of water behind one of these, so only 1 kilometer long. The water's collected in the first rains and then backs up behind these embankments. And then during the beginning of the dry season, it begins to drain off, but some of it is still retained there, which normally wouldn't be retained. Enigmatic zigzag earthworks crisscross the landscape between forest islands, and spider-like web-like networks in the region of Boweries. I now interpret these as earthen fish weirs. With a simple technology, fish migrating across the savannas in the wet season could be channelized into and caught in basketry traps set in the openings of these structures. With this passive technology, fishermen could you could probably go to work, or set your trap in the morning, go to work, and then in the afternoon come back and have an incredible harvest of fish. And then there's also these little ponds that are associated with them. And even today, they're chock full of fish. These would be essentially Amazonian refrigerators for storing fish during the periods when you don't need them, but you can harvest them at will when necessary. There are also tens of thousands of artificial forest islands. Almost every one that we visited, a small sample of these, has evidence of human occupation on them. These would have been small hamlets and villages. We also documented very large earthworks. These are called lomas or occupation mounds. Some of these are terraced, quite massive structures. One that Bill Belay and I worked on a number of years ago extends 18 meters in height. You can almost see above the canopy of the forest that remains there. So these peoples, the people responsible for this impressive management are gone, and the descendants have forgotten this technology. Landscape archaeology provides an important means of documenting important lost knowledge as politicians, conservationists, and aid agencies seek sustainable solutions to both develop and conserve the Amazon. Archaeologists can play a key role in providing time-tested models of land use. Some heavily humanized and engineered landscapes of the past strangely correspond with high biodiversity in the present. Today, peoples are impacting these same localities, but in ways that are dramatically different from those of the past. Nevertheless, contemporary society would be in a better position to manage these settings in the present and future by understanding their long, dynamic, and complex human history. Thank you.
So now we invite Christina Lyons, please, for the podium.
No. Okay, so good morning to everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this, and really excited about the conversation today. I want to start by talking about a publication called Colombia Amphibia, or Amphibious Colombia, that was released by a government scientific research institute in 2015, arguing that we in Colombia live in a country of wetlands. So the title not only refers to an ecosystem that makes up 26% of the national territory and encompasses 87% of the population, but also proposes a conceptual shift towards understanding that Colombia is nourished by 48,000 wetlands and marshes, which throughout the year experience dynamic and intermittent cycles fluctuating between flooding and dryness, relatively firm land to water. So many indigenous people and coastal populations have long taken this amphibious reality into account, attuning their modes of inhabiting the territory based on water's pulsations. Ancestral modes of building rely on elevated houses and structures so as not to rupture the connectivity of wetland systems and to avoid flooding cycles. Rural communities grow yucca and plantains in the floodplains of the Amazon's mammoth rivers, where the nutrient-rich sediments that travel down the torrential waterways of the Andes mountain range are deposited. They do not seek to procure property titles for these lands, respecting their oscillation between solid and fluid states, soil and water. Other communities inhabit the Amazon's inundated forests, interchanging between walking and paddling to move across the landscape. Despite these ongoing ancestral and popular practices, unplanned urban expansion and the spontaneous movement of populations provoked by over 60 years of social and armed conflict, land grabbing, poverty, and the marginalization of indigenous and local knowledges have led to the occupation of many riparian buffer zones and floodplains, as well as a heavy reliance on concrete and zinc for building. Due to these water-based challenges, Colombia's current National Development Plan proposes a transformation in territorial planning to focus on water, linked to environmental justice concerns. The prioritization of water-based planning acknowledges that not only the lack of availability of clean water and the dumping of wastewater are structural problems, only 48% of wastewater is treated in the country, but that our relationships with water are deepening the conditions of vulnerability of specific human populations, causing the degradation of aquatic ecosystems and producing challenges for disaster risk anticipation, along with climate change adaptation. So the country's Amazon region, which constitutes approximately 35% of the total territory and 6.8% of the Amazonas River drainage basin, is a strategic area to begin this water-sensitive planning shift. The state of Putumayo, where I've engaged in research since 2004, is part of the Andean-Amazonian transition, where the Putumayo and Caquetá rivers originate, both affluents that contribute 22% of the water flow to the Amazonas basin. These waters are born in the Andean paramos and become the torrential rivers of the Andean Amazonian foothills, later converting into the meandric waterways of the Amazonian plains that contribute to the flying or atmospheric rivers that are crucial to the global water cycle for their role in transporting massive amounts of moisture from the tropics towards the poles. This movement of vapor greatly affects precipitation levels, cloud formation, and therefore has a significant impact on air temperature, sea ice, and the distribution of water supplies. However, along with this moisture, these same rivers transport significant amounts of sediment to the Atlantic, impacting the ocean's nutrient cycle. So both the movement of sediment and moisture contribute to what scientists refer to as the AAA, or Andean Amazon Atlantic Pathway. Atmospheric rivers can cause severe flooding when they are particularly intense, as well as contribute to drought conditions connected to the deforestation of the Amazon. So there is no way to talk about Amazonian forest loss and conservation without considering the relationship between tree cover and the region's watersheds, water circulation, and water quality. Despite this, most policy attention is placed on tackling deforestation, while residents of the basin itself experience intensifying flooding and drought conditions, have no drinking water, clean drinking water, and limited management of wastewater, if at all, among other social environmental conflicts and public health risks. So in Valle de Sibundoy, located in what is referred to as the subregion Alto Putumayo, the forests of the memory of the lagoon called Quindicocha, or Lagoon of the Hummingbird by Inga indigenous people, and Tabanok, or Place of Origin by Kamsha people, returns every rainy season and challenges the pretensions of a drainage district that was constructed in 1968 by the then Colombian Institute of Agrarian Reform. This engineering project, designed with the aspiration of converting the region to a bastion of agricultural production, involved the desiccation of 9,500 hectares of lagoon and surrounding wetlands, including the construction of 4 artificial canals that modified the flow of the Putumayo River and other bodies of water that descend upon the Valle's floodplain. So the haunting reappearance of Quindicocha during the rainy season is a result of the lack of maintenance of the drainage district, exacerbated by deforestation of the slopes of the foothills due to cattle raising and monoculture agriculture. These factors cause increasing amounts of sediment to obstruct the canals and result in flooding, causing property damage and displacement, problems that are difficult to solve by the mere use of dredges to maintain the district, which is what state agencies continue to propose. In the capital city of Putumayo, Mocoa, 57 engineered mitigation works are being constructed in the torrential rivers and streams of the Andean Amazonian foothills, with the intention of preventing future hydrometeorological disasters. On March 31, 2017, heavy rains fell on the city, causing a torrential landslide involving 4 rivers and 2 streams in the upper area of the Caquetá River watershed. So, according to official sources, 335 people lost their lives, 57 remained disappeared, 7 neighborhoods were destroyed and 48 more were affected. 1,462 homes were damaged or wrecked, leaving 22,344 people impacted, and over 2,000 of those being indigenous. So elderly members of the riverside communities and institutional documents report similar landslides and torrential floods since 1947. During these events, there is only mention of the death of cows, and more recently damage to some homes. However, this was before the demographic explosion in Mocoa, after more than 20,000 victims of the country's armed conflict migrated to the municipality between 1998 and 2008, generating greater pressures on the water bodies and causing sections of the foothills to be deforested and neighborhoods to expand. So like most Amazonian municipalities that are experiencing accelerated and spontaneous urban growth, Mocoa's territorial planning mechanisms had not been updated. There was also no watershed planning management plan, or POMCAs, what they're known in Colombia, for the Mocoa River Basin at the time. And these omissions, exacerbated by political corruption, which involved granting people the right to live in risk zones in exchange for electoral votes, created conditions of double vulnerability, where already displaced and low-income families ended up living in disaster-prone areas. Decisively, Inga indigenous people in Mocoa ancestrally named one of the torrential streams that participated in this event La Taruca, which in Inga means the deer. They gave it this name because, like the land mammal, La Taruca has a tendency to jump and change course. For this reason, according to what could be called their ancestral territorial planning, these communities did not inhabit the deer's territory, an area they understood to not only encompass its permanent invisible channel, but also its maximum capacity to jump, expand, and surprise. Further down the Putumayo watershed in the Amazonian plains, the municipality of Puerto Asís is built on a system of wetlands. 503 hectares, or 43 of these, are located within the urban area, constituting part of what is an interconnected ecology between dry land, cananguchales, wetlands, and Amazonian blackwater streams that supply water to the wells of almost 80% of the urban population of Puerto Asís, approximately 38,901 people. Unfortunately, again, in this case, unplanned urban and agricultural expansion, deforestation, occupation of flood zones, inadequate management of wastewater, and the filling of wetlands have contributed not only to the degradation of this aquatic ecosystem, but are also causing water shortages during dry periods and a greater risk of flooding when precipitation intensifies. Equally worrying are the threats made to the lives of environmental activists when we try to protect these wetlands from illegal occupation and contamination, in a context where municipal and environmental authorities do not guarantee effectual or participatory forms of environmental governance, nor do they implement sufficient sanctioning measures. Siona indigenous people in Puerto Asís are what these people call their ancestral territory, Coronia, named a river in the region Mecaya, which means leaf-cutting ant in their language, Maicoca. This name reflects that the river shares characteristics with the ant, appreciated for its ability to transport large quantities of leaf litter to make channels in the clay-based soils of the Amazonian plains. The name reflects the hydrogeological dynamics of the Andes and the Amazon, where the fluvial movement and deposition of sediment is not a threat that requires mitigation works, but rather a cyclical and fundamental process that nourishes the agrobiodiversity and recharges the aquifers of the lower areas of the basin. What happens when the actions of certain human populations increase the sediment load from the upper zones of the watersheds through deforestation and illegal mining? What geologic disturbances result from exploratory activities conducted by extractive multinational corporations in a foothill laden with fault lines? What happens when we drain Amazonian wetlands to build more neighborhoods, as you can see in this photo, and urban projects, eliminating their capacity to act as buffers against flooding and drought? In line with these questions, we can say that there are no such things as floods, if this term refers to destructive events caused by rivers. Rather, these events are the product of the active memory of water bodies, reclaiming their territories, and in the process, doing what rivers that originate in the mountains do when they carry rock and sediment back to the sea. All the rivers that end in Ya in the Andean Amazonian territory were named by the Siona, just as all the rivers that end in Yaco were named by Inga people. These names relate to the personalities of the water bodies, the lived experiences of these communities, and the fauna and flora that surround and form part of these basins. The ancestral way of naming La Taruca recognizes an animalistic identity with an active spirit of a deer. It provides details that surpasses the generic technoscientific classification of water flows in Colombia in the categories of rivers, streams, and reels. These two ways of naming, one based on the size of water flow, and the other based on the personality, characteristics, and behaviors of a being, are not simply two perspectives or ways of referring to the same entity, but rather arise from different ways of knowing and relating to watery bodies. The stream called La Taruca is not only a stream, but also a deer. I say not only to point out that the deer pre-existed the modern science of hydrology that converted it into what it is now, also a stream. The name deer resists being stigmatized as a violent torrential water that requires damming, dikes, and cement barriers. As the philosopher Gaston Bachelard reminds us, waters that are represented as rabiosa, or violent, inspire acts of human-induced violence and retaliation against them. So part of my research and activism is asking how the territorial planning of the city of Mocoa might have changed and can still change, because it hasn't actually been reconstructed despite that 6 years have passed, might have changed if its inhabitants and municipal authorities had respected their occupation, not only amid rivers and streams, but also in the territory of a jumping deer. This is the Ariera hormiga that I was talking about, the mecaya. And this is also showing you Porto Asís on the wetlands disappearing through urban expansion. So the hydrological phenomena that occur not only in the municipality of Mocoa, but throughout the Andean Amazonian basins and other amphibious territories of the Amazon, urgently require that we return to the proposal made by Gustave Wilches Chaus when he described the need to respect the right to the free development of the personality of rivers, including their right to expand, be absorbed, flow somewhere, and interact and remain connected with other elements and materials. The tragic loss of human lives caused by fluvial landslides, floods, and droughts is the product of state negligence, corruption, and the injustices that unequally affect different sets of human communities. While the injustices committed against more than human beings, occupied riparian corridors and wetlands, mountains and foothills stripped bare by deforestation, and rivers now filled with cement and strangled by engineering projects, exceed the liberal and Western logics of risk management and spatial planning in and beyond the Amazon. The fluvial beings of the past disturb the chronicity of temporal existence when they manifest to recover their lost spaces, showing us that the past is never completely resolved and much less mitigatable by engineering logics and infrastructure. They teach us, in the words of the philosopher Martin Skowronski, to anticipate an after to every ending. Today I have discussed fluvial endings that manifest through hauntings and ongoing memory of water, which leads me to conceptualize the hydrogeologic events in the Amazon as the ghosts of other hydrogeologies, specifically ancestral hydrogeologies. In this brief presentation, I have emphasized the importance of recovering the meaning and relational significance of the ancestral names of Amazonian water bodies, Quindicocha, Tawanok, Taruca, Mecaya, among many others, not only for their spiritual importance and biocultural heritage, but because these names teach us important lessons to guide territorial planning and architectural decisions based on water, as well as how to transform risk anticipation and climate change adaptability in the largest and most important amphibious territory on the planet. What can we learn from the ghosts of other hydrologies for current ways of living and inhabiting the Amazon that would respect the force, pulsation, and crucial flow of water and sediment between, over, and below the basin's tropical forest or selva? Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you so
Warm
much.
regards from Brasília, and it's a huge pleasure to be here with you today, and special thanks to Catherine and Vanessa for inviting me to contribute, and most importantly also to the Perry World House for hosting me as their fellow, where I really identified being there in Philadelphia last December, an ecology of knowledge that very much inspired the discussions that we are having here today. It's quite special for me to be here in this week, because we had the definition of the COP30 president that will guide Brazil in hosting and presiding the 30th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and also the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, which will happen for the first time in the Amazon in November this year. And a lot of the determination of Brazil for hosting and inviting the international community to come to Belém and for COP30 came from not only the symbolic nature of this initiative, but also climate urgency on one hand. In terms of the symbolism, it is going to be the first time that the world comes to the Amazon instead of to talk about climate change, instead of having the Amazon being a topic of discussion elsewhere. So this inversion, this disruption of international decision-making is very much at the core of the architecture of ecologies that we very much want the Brazilian presidency of COP30 to be guided by. And we also pursue this road, and I think it's very good to be part of this panel and having heard a lot of the discussions about this intersection between architecture, archaeology, anthropology, and ecology. A lot of the humility that we are having as COP30 presidency comes from understanding that not only do we need to give participation to indigenous peoples, peoples who have been learning the Brazilian society and the world for a long time now, that we would be reaching climate urgency as we are now, but also this importance for us to learn from them and go beyond traditional and Western-oriented scientific knowledge to learn from their wisdom, from their traditional knowledge, not only in stewardship of ecologies, but also in terms of resilience, because that is something that we will need a lot in the context of climate change. This week also marks a tragic identification scientific record, which is the fact that not only did we have 2024 as the first year in which we went beyond the 1.5 above degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, so above what science tells us that it's safe, humanly speaking. But also this month, last month of January, actually we reached 1.75, which is very drastic in terms of the urgency that we are facing before us. So we really need to change our mindsets. And we have a lot to learn from indigenous peoples, and here in Brasília, very important and perhaps historical development is that for the first time we have the indigenous peoples at the very core of the Brazilian national government, with the unprecedented establishment of the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, who is led by Minister Sônia Guajajara, a very respected indigenous leader, who is also at the very core and front and center of the design of COP30. So we really wish COP30 to be this inflection point in which we learn a lot and, from indigenous peoples, not going way beyond only participation. But part of also the urgency that we are feeling as Brazilian society comes from the realization that the Amazon biome is on the risk of tipping point, of an irreversible collapse of the integrity of the Amazon biome, the Amazon ecosystem, due to a disruption of the flying rivers, which is a dynamic that Professor Christina has alluded to in her talk. And this is absolutely critical, because if we have the collapse of the flying rivers dynamic, we will have also virtually the entire Brazilian climate being disrupted, and beyond Brazil, the world as well is going to be disrupted. If we have this tipping point in a process that we would lead to the savanization of the Amazon, this process, according to science, would have global repercussions that could actually prevent the fight against climate change to succeed. So if it is with this sense of urgency, this sense of gravity that we preside over COP30, but COP30 has not started this year. We actually also presided over the G20 last year, the group that gathers the 20 greatest economies and also the major emitters. So any solution to climate change needs to involve all major economies. And we also, before that in 2023, we gathered all countries in the Amazon region to strengthen the governance of the Amazon and to promote sustainable development within the organization of countries of the Treaty of Amazon Cooperation. And this was very successful, but the challenge is huge. We have two drivers of a possible tipping point of the Amazon. One is deforestation. The second one is the increase of the global temperature. Recent scientific research indicates that any range between 1.5 and 2 degrees of global warming above the industrial levels could make the Amazon vulnerable to the tipping point. And then the challenge of the Brazilian society is, on the one hand, to stop deforestation, and on the other, to mobilize climate action to an extent that would allow us to achieve the global temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, which is a very hard challenge, given that the world emissions, they continue to rise. In order to do this very, to undertake this extremely complex diplomatic endeavor, we are also trying to mobilize different processes, different stakeholders, different mechanisms, combining local governance with regional and global initiatives that could offer multi-level governance that is up to this task of fighting a complex issue as the deforestation of the Amazon and climate change itself. A lot of the work that we have been doing also involve not only mobilizing a global effort against climate change, and the Brazilian G20 last year was very successful in that, but also launch new initiatives, unprecedented initiatives, to try to reach new solutions to this unprecedented challenge. A lot of it involves bioeconomy, which Professor William also alluded to in terms of the creating and developing sustainable supply chains in the Amazon that would enable sustainable creation of value to local population, that would in turn reduce the pressure over the Amazon. In addition to that, we also have a very strong national effort against deforestation since 2023. Obviously, we had this challenge of reverting the dismantling of a number of environmental institutions that were put in place to tackle deforestation, but this unfortunate movement from the previous government. But the good news is that since 2023, we have been able to reduce deforestation rates in the Amazon by 50%. This will not be enough. We need to eliminate deforestation by 2030, but for that, we need to think about different kind of initiatives that will also treat climate change and deforestation in a multidimensional manner, building synergies between environmental objectives on the one hand and social inclusion and economic prosperity on the other. A lot of the policies related to empowering indigenous peoples, they are mutually supportive with these efforts of preserving preserving forests and restoring forests and fighting climate change. And a whole new effort is not only to tackle deforestation, but actually promote an unprecedented movement of forest restoration to build back what has been lost. And this will require new supply chains, new technologies, a combination of local, regional, and national efforts, and also the connection of local solutions to global capital markets to enable a scaled up and accelerated restoration of the Amazon forest in a way that will allow the biome to increase its resilience as we move to a warmer climate. There are different interplays between the global policy making, geopolitics, national policy making, local policy making, and the participation of the civil society and indigenous peoples as well in these efforts. But the most important that we're finding is that we need to change paradigms and we need to change our mindsets towards an ecology of solutions, an architecture of ecology in which we finally understand and acknowledge, like the indigenous peoples have been have done for so long, that we are part of nature, that we are independent, interdependent among ourselves, but also with nature. And our conviction is that perhaps this challenge can serve as an opportunity for this inflection to happen. An inflection that has to be interdisciplinary, that has to merge policymakers, diplomats, and politicians with artists, philosophers, archaeologists, and anthropologists, so that we can finally come together with a bundle of solutions, and as I said, an ecology of solutions. Unfortunately, I won't be able to be with you for the Q&A, because also today we are having a mission of the UN Executive Secretary of Climate Change, in which we are discussing the strategies, some of the challenges and opportunities around COP30 with our peers at the UN. But I'm very happy to have been given this opportunity to present to you some of the challenges, but also perhaps this message of inspiration and hope that this existential threat perhaps can move us to a future of shared prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Túlio, for joining us. And now, please, I'm welcoming the speakers to the panel so we can have a small conversation, and then we're gonna open up the discussion to the public also. So please, William, Clark, and Christina. Challenges to Western epistemic frameworks, we can ask how the located ancestral knowledges revealed by ethnographers and archaeologists can contribute, for example, for policy making that operates at the level of local development, including, for example, urban planning, agricultural practices, or architectural design, or at the level of conservation policies of the forest. But if policies are legal frameworks, they also point at the problem of how to index, classify, or categorize all this ancestral knowledge, or if even attempting to do so without first changing our frameworks, it will be fruitless in a way. So if we acknowledge the Amazonian forest as a kind of Borgesian infinite library or a type of ancestral knowledges, how could we classify it, or if we need actually to classify it, to make it operative? So in a way, how all these new categories that will be relying on these ethnographic and anthropological and archaeological views could enter conversations, for example, of policy making or urban design or architectural design in a way, or if we need new categories to do so, or these new categories are going to be born out of our observations from these ethnographic approaches.
Well, in archaeology, most of the past that we know about is unfortunately of the upper strata of society because of excavations focused on mainly on elite palaces, temples, monuments. But to really understand the everyday lives of peoples of the past, you've got to go out to the places where they were, and most archaeologists don't do that. But for instance, most of the work, even in rural areas in the past, would be focused on residential sites, small hamlets, villages. So essentially, we can assume that the people of the past maybe got 8 hours of sleep a night. They spent that time in those structures. But the rest of the day, they were out in the countryside. And they left an incredible record of repeated human action, pathways, roadways, building walls, which structure, in a sense, they're creating a landscape that's a model of their society. And a model for their society at the same time, because once it's embedded in the landscape, all the structure, fields, earthworks, causeways, canals, fence lines, house locations, how do you connect them? That's all interpretable through the material record. And so I think this is one way that archaeology can contribute to this ancestral knowledge.
You used the word knowledge in the plural, which I think is a neologism, knowledges, which implies that there are different kinds of knowledges or different ways of knowing things, which, you could say is different epistemologies. The definition of knowledge, I'm teaching a class on indigenous knowledge and tropical forests, so I very recently read in a dictionary, definition of knowledge is awareness of a fact or of facts. So are we talking about different ways of seeing the same thing? Yes, if you take what's philosophically now an philosophical anthropology, they call it perspectivism. Yeah, different ways of seeing the same thing. And we must remember Durkheim, who said social facts are things. Look at them as things. We can look at the landscape and impacts of people, and the fact that we're talking about, as Clark is implying, place-making peoples. They don't just adapt to that environment, but they actually make it and have made it, which is a reasonably recent viewpoint coming from historical ecology and is amply documented now. There's lots of evidence to show that that's the case with Amazonian indigenous peoples, that they've had an impact that isn't just simply the result of adaptationism, but rather of human agency. So the idea would be to understand these interactions. Can you hear me still? I don't think this thing's on. Understand these interactions in a more objective sense, in the sense of seeing things from their point of view as much as possible, and therefore to incorporate that knowledge into policy. And it's going to require a lot of careful study archaeologically, but also in terms of the inventory of the species that people are, having an interrelationship with, such as these non-timber forest products that I talked about earlier, that could enable what Túlio Andrade was saying, which was, a more sustainable way. And I hate to use that word, so overused, but I can't think of a better one. So, occupying the environment, even if we're talking about cities, because cities could be like low-density urbanism or garden cities or garden urbanism, which are terms now being used thanks to the discovery of sites similar to what Professor Erickson's talking about, which are different ways of living and having lived and occupied Amazonian environments.
So I think that the biggest challenges right now has to do with political corruption. I don't think that there's not an awareness of these other alternatives. I think there are many living, peoples who not even the necessity to go back in time, but that, have that living memory and can reconstruct that, right, in the communities. And it's an impossibility because of the corruption in contracting, but also when you find public officials or whoever is elected administrations and who's ever in different secretarial planning spaces, and they do seem interested in, or they recognize the need for change and for transformation and doing things differently, there's always a monetary issue. Amazonian municipalities are the poorest, they're quinto or sexto. I mean, I don't know how it works now in every country, the categories, but there's not resources because they don't produce taxes, right? They don't have enough population to count for electoral votes really at a national level. They're not interesting constituents for these politicians. So there's those, both of those that, so I think that there's these different forces. I mean, I see lots of people creating alternative educational center, and in Amazon, for instance, indigenous universities, being a university in Colombia, and alternative AMA, Indian Amazonian schooling that's not institutionalized, bringing back ECAs, ecological, all these community grassroots-based, citizen-led efforts that hit up against the same problem, structural barriers, right? That on the one hand, resources, on the other, that the corruption. And I wanted to ask, and I'm sorry that Túlio was not able to join us, but the COP30, in a similar way, if they're just convoking government officials, regionally, locally, or nationally, there is all this corruption. It's corrupt. Environmental authorities that are corrupt, administrations that are corrupt, and there's always a parallel COP, which is all the community organizations, the grassroots organizations, the indigenous communities, artists, students, and they're not actually, we're not in conversation. And so I think that it's troubling to me that always there's this, we're getting together with our colleagues and we're convoking the government's officials, but that's the root of the problem. So anyways, I would just leave that. I wish she was here.
Thanks so much. So now, since we have little time, I'm gonna open up to the public and have some questions already here and here. So
thank you so much for you for the amazing presentations. I think we need the mic. I just for the Zoom and the translation. Okay, thank you. I want to give Christina the opportunity to clarify what you mean by corruption. And because it might seem that you're talking about corruption in Colombia, and what you described is precisely what I would call capitalism modus operandi, that is right here, right now, and we are under a very heavy cloud of what you call corruption. I don't call it corruption, I call it capitalism. That's how it works.
It's a good comparison.
response, or like take one question? Yeah, maybe we can take it. Have a question.
I just wanted to remind everyone that we are occupying right now the Secretary of Education in Pará, which is holding COP30 for 30 days now. And the resistance is there because the government wants to take all the teachers out of the isolated areas, which means indigenous areas, quilombola areas, riverside people areas that are getting considered very expensive. So they are taking the teachers out of the areas and putting computers with the Starlink satellite. So now we have all this metadata available of the indigenous communities and the riverside communities available to Starlink. And then we are occupying for 30 days the building, and the government has no answer for the movement until now. So all this, unfortunately, Túlio is not here to say what they expect to be done in the next days, but it's very dangerous and preoccupying situation now, I think. We have to, be aware of that.
Could I say something real quick? You brought up Starlink, and it makes me think of President-elect Musk. That, we're not, and I was talking about, and most of us have been talking about how modernity has impacted Amazonia, how it's involved in climate change, and all that, sort of we can take more or less as facts. But Eisenhower's military-industrial complex came about the same time we're developing this modern world, post-World War II system called globalization. Only with Starlink and with capitalism, I thought that was a good analogy that you made, that in fact we're not talking about a global system anymore. Actually, that so-called world system it seems to be also out in space. So it requires a rethinking, I think, even of modernity. But I thought that was a really good comment. Thanks.
Yeah, so I don't know if there are any other comments.
Yeah. More than a question, it's a comment. Your presentations were amazing, and you're inviting us to look into these practices that have been able for indigenous communities to adapt to the territories and create these resilient cultural landscapes. The only problem is that we have a very different scale of urbanization and velocity. So I think that our goal, our task, is to try to learn from these practices and try to see how we convert them, how we extract the essence of these practices, but connect them to the urban demands. Because that I think is one of the gaps, and that's what we have to explore in these interdisciplinary groups. No, it's not just a copy-paste operation. Being very creative.
I think this thing's not working. Do you want me to say something? On the Brazilian case, this is just not just tropical forests in Brazil, but tropical forests, say, in Southeast Asia, a serious problem with this monocropping of a very heavily capitalized crop. Brazil, and I've seen these fields, maybe you have, gigantic fields of soybean that have destroyed massive amounts of forest around Santarém and going to the east as well. I've seen that. And then that is the analog to the oil palm in Sumatra, Java, Malaysia, that is just completely devastated forest. But it isn't that plant itself. What it is it's the heavy-duty monopolized, capitalism behind it. And now the fact that so many products are coming from those things, like from soy or from oil palm. And I think the solution in the Brazilian, the Amazon case, is to adapt the knowledge that's acquired as to what grows in these heavily open spaces now, which are much bigger than the light gaps native peoples have made, and therefore to begin to transplant those kinds of successful long-term living species under some kind of artificial shade system to get them to repopulate these devastated areas by cattle pastures on the one hand. Now, the soybean is another thing because that's being mechanized and regenerated fertilizer and that kind of thing. So that somehow the land tenure system has to change in order to adopt indigenous knowledge. That'd be my take on it.
To respond, I didn't mean to suggest that what I was talking about is isolated to Colombia or that corruption is a complete aspect of capitalism. I think that all of these movements that I refer to as resistance, alternative, transformative, oppositional, it's all about the root of the issue of capitalism and neoliberalism, right, in its manifestation currently or even post, I don't know what we're in now in that sense. But so I think, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I use the word corruption because that's how people talk about it locally. But I think there's a real, we keep electing these people. We are re-electing these people in the offices to perpetuate this, right? So what is the crisis, right? And there's a crisis in education, public education. We're not creating critical thinking humans. We are not actually understanding the history at all. We don't recognize colonial history. We don't recognize histories of slavery. We don't understand the structural. People can't do structural analysis of anything. The majority of the population, if you ask people to understand structural issues, that's not how they understand what's going on. They don't make those connections. There's something, right? There's huge problems in why we keep electing those people in to the offices that then control, and we say they're corrupt, but they're just perpetuating wealth, and even wealth and capitalists, as you're mentioning. I don't think, so I think how can these practices be incorporated is a huge challenge in that sense, right? Because it's not just about finding engineers or finding architects or finding planners that are open to listening to other knowledges, understanding that they do not have expertise, but there are multiple forms of knowing and expertises, and the importance of these practices that were harmonious or more resilient in these landscapes, right? And how they can be in moments of intensified urbanization and capitalism, gone wild, right? And monocropping and deforestation, but that's not the only, right? Because they're also in a structure that doesn't allow them, as I was saying, to make those changes either. These individuals that would be open to it, that might have more possibility because they're in positions of power or administrative roles. So, I don't know, so anyways, just to say, yeah, I'm not in disagreement with what you said, but I'm saying it's not, corruption is a part of this, right? Like the same system that you're talking about.
Okay, thank you so much. Time's up for the first panel. So thank you all, our speakers, and thank you also. Thank you.